Imagine ruling an empire while something inside you is dying. Not a blade, not poison, but your own flesh, turning against you. A queen whose belly swelled with rot, whose organs collapsed one by one, trapped in a bed she built with blood and prayer. This is how power dies. Before we descend into Isabella's final days, if you're fascinated by the darker side of history, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Leave a comment what historical death should we cover next. Isabella of Castile ruled from 1474 to 1504, carving her authority across a fractured Spain at a time when Europe itself was reshaping. She inherited a kingdom torn by civil war, nobility who saw her as a pawn, and a throne she had to fight her own half-brother to claim. By the time she died, she had unified two of the most powerful crowns on the continent, funded the expedition that opened the Americas to Europe, conquered the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, and imposed a religious order so absolute it would define Spanish identity for centuries. Her achievements were monumental. In 1492 alone, she completed the Reconquista by taking Granada after a decade-long siege, expelled the Jewish population from her realms, and commissioned Christopher Columbus to sail west in search of Asia. She restructured Castile's treasury, professionalized its military, and centralized royal authority in ways that transformed medieval governance into something approaching modern statecraft. Alongside her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, she forged a dual monarchy that would become the foundation of imperial Spain. But Isabella was not just a political symbol. She was a woman who carried the physical toll of power in ways her male counterparts never did. She bore 8 pregnancies between 1478 and 1500. 5 of her children survived infancy. Each pregnancy strained her body. Each birth carried the medieval risk of infection, hemorrhage, and lifelong complications. She traveled constantly, often pregnant or recently delivered, moving between battlefronts, court sessions, and diplomatic negotiations. During the siege of Granada, she lived in military encampments in winter, enduring cold and illness while months from giving birth. The chroniclers who documented her reign described a woman of relentless will. She walked among plague victims without hesitation. She wore armor when necessary. She fasted rigorously for religious discipline, sometimes to the point of physical weakness. Her piety was absolute, her sense of duty unyielding, but the same body that carried her through decades of warfare, statecraft and childbirth was quietly breaking under the strain. By 1503, Isabella was 52 years old. She had survived longer than most women of her era, but survival is not the same as health. The cumulative damage of pregnancy, stress, medieval medicine, and unrelenting responsibility had left marks no crown could hide, and soon, those marks would become something far worse than exhaustion. The first signs appeared during the siege of Granada in the winter of 1491. Isabella was 40 years old, heavily involved in the final push to take the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, and she fell gravely ill. The fever struck hard enough that rumors spread through the military camp that the queen might die. Her physicians recorded inflammation in her stomach and womb, terms they used broadly for any abdominal distress in women. She recovered, or appeared to, but the episode left something behind. Medieval medicine had no understanding of chronic infection, of scar tissue forming deep inside the pelvis, of damage that could lie dormant for years before resurging. For the next decade, Isabella seemed invincible. She governed with the same intensity, managed diplomacy across Europe, and continued bearing the responsibilities of rule. But those close to her began to notice subtle changes. Her ladies-in-waiting observed that she moved more carefully when rising from chairs. She sometimes pressed her hand to her lower abdomen during long council sessions, a gesture she dismissed when questioned. There were days when her color looked drained, when she appeared unusually fatigued. Despite adequate rest, Isabella herself refused to acknowledge weakness. She had built her authority on the perception of strength, on being present, visible, and unyielding. To admit illness was to invite political vulnerability. Her reign had been defined by showing no hesitation, no fragility. So, when the discomfort returned, a dull ache, low in her belly, occasional sharp pains that came and when she treated it, as she treated everything else, something to endure through willpower. The medical understanding of the era offered little help. Physicians believed the body operated through a balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Women's bodies were considered inherently unstable, prone to imbalances caused by their reproductive organs. Symptoms like abdominal pain, fatigue, and fever in women were often attributed to disorders of the womb, corrupted humors, or excessive moisture. Treatments focused on purging, bloodletting, and herbal remedies meant to dry or heat the body, depending on the supposed imbalance. What was actually happening inside Isabella's body was far more specific and far more dangerous. The inflammation from 1491 had likely caused a chronic pelvic infection, possibly an abscess that had partially healed but never fully resolved. Scar tissue formed, bacteria remained dormant in tissue pockets. The repeated strain of pregnancy, the physical stress of constant travel and work, and the invasive medical treatments of the time created conditions for that infection to reactivate. By 1502, the pain was no longer something she could ignore in private. It had become persistent, a companion that followed her through every decision, every public appearance, every night she tried to sleep. Isabella had access to the finest medical minds in Castile. Royal physicians trained in the universities of Salamanca and Bologna attended her. They consulted texts from Galen and Hippocrates, followed protocols refined over centuries. Yet everything they believed about the human body, particularly the female body, was fundamentally wrong. Medieval and early Renaissance medicine operated on the theory of humoral balance. Health required equilibrium between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Women were considered naturally colder and wetter than men, their bodies governed by the uterus, which physicians believed could wander through the torso, causing various ailments. Menstruation, pregnancy, and menopause were all seen as processes of purging excess moisture and corrupt matter. When a woman presented with abdominal pain, fever, and fatigue, the diagnosis was almost always some variant of uterine disorder or imbalance of the feminine humors. Isabella's physicians diagnosed her with what they termed a malady of the womb and bowels. They believed corrupted humors had accumulated in her lower abdomen, creating heat and Some attributed her suffering to divine trial, viewing illness in a queen as a test of faith or punishment for sin. Treatment followed established protocol: bloodletting to reduce excess heat, purgatives to expel corrupted matter, herbal baths with warming or cooling properties depending on the suspected imbalance, and prayer to address spiritual causes. These treatments did not help. In many cases, they made things worse. Bloodletting weakened an already compromised immune system. Purgatives caused dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. Herbal preparations, while sometimes mildly antiseptic, could not reach deep internal infections. The physicians had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of sepsis, and no ability to diagnose what was actually destroying the queen from within. Modern medical analysis, based on the recorded symptoms and progression, suggests Isabella suffered from a chronic pelvic infection that developed into a pelvic abscess. This likely originated from complications of childbirth. In an era before antiseptic technique, every birth carried the risk of introducing bacteria into the uterus and surrounding tissues. 8 pregnancies meant 8 opportunities for infection. Retained placental tissue, tears in the uterine wall, or bacterial contamination during delivery could all seed infections that might smolder for years. Before becoming acute, the abscess would have formed in the pelvic cavity, possibly involving the uterus, ovaries, or nearby tissue. As it grew, it would cause the persistent pain, fever, and abdominal swelling her attendants observed. Eventually, such abscesses can rupture, spilling infected material into the abdominal cavity. This leads to peritonitis, a widespread infection of the membrane lining the abdomen. Without antibiotics, peritonitis is almost universally fatal. The infection triggers systemic inflammation, organ failure, and septic shock. Isabella's physicians could see her abdomen swelling. They could feel the heat of fever. They could smell the subtle changes that indicated internal decay, but they had no framework to understand what they were witnessing. She had the best medical care available in early 16th century Europe, which meant she had care that was not only useless but actively harmful. The irony is brutal. Her wealth and status guaranteed she would receive every treatment that could hasten her death. By early 1503, Isabella's condition could no longer be hidden. Her abdomen began to swell visibly, distending in a way that alarmed her attendants. It was not the familiar swelling of pregnancy. This was different, harder, more unnatural. When her ladies helped her dress, they could see the tautness of her skin, the way her body had changed shape. The queen, who had once moved with authority, now moved cautiously, as though afraid something inside might tear. The fever became constant. It no longer rose and fell with the day. It burned steadily, leaving her face flushed and her skin hot to the touch. Sweat soaked her bed linens repeatedly. Her attendants changed them multiple times each day, but within hours the fabric would be damp again. She shivered despite the heat radiating from her body, wrapping herself in blankets even as her temperature climbed. Pain dominated her existence. She could not stand without assistance. Sitting upright sent sharp sensations through her lower abdomen. Lying flat made breathing difficult, as though the swelling pressed against her lungs. Her attendants arranged pillows to prop her half upright, searching for any position that might offer relief. There was none. Every movement, every breath, every shift of weight brought fresh waves of agony. She pressed her hand to her belly constantly, as if holding something in place, as if pressure might contain what was happening inside. Then came the smell. It started subtly as sourness in the air that her ladies attributed to fever and sickness, but within weeks it grew stronger, unmistakable. It was the smell of infection, of tissue breaking down, of something rotting inside a living body. Incense burned constantly in her chambers, but it only mixed with the odor rather than masking it. Servants exchanged frightened glances. They understood what that smell meant, even if they could not name it. Despite everything, Isabella continued to rule. She received advisors from her bed, listening to reports even when pain made her gasp mid-conversation. She signed documents, her hand trembling but her signature still firm. She made decisions about succession, about governance, about the future of her kingdoms, all while her body collapsed around her. It was an act of will that defied logic. The same iron determination that had carried her through civil war and conquest, now directed entirely towards staying conscious, staying coherent, staying in control. Turcotte watched, with a mixture of admiration and horror. Whispers spread through the corridors. The queen is dying. How much longer can she last? What happens when she can no longer sign her name? Factions began to form quietly. Ferdinand, her husband, and Corolla understood that Isabella's death would shift the balance of power dramatically. Castile was hers by inheritance, not his. Nobles aligned themselves carefully, preparing for the transition they all saw coming. Isabella sensed it all. Even through the fever and pain, her political instincts remained sharp. She knew what her weakness meant for the realm. She fought to maintain authority over her own succession, to ensure her daughter Joanna would inherit Castile, to prevent the kingdom from fracturing the moment she stopped breathing. But control over a nation means nothing when you cannot control your own flesh. The infection spreading through her abdomen followed no decrees. It answered to no crown, and it was winning. Isabella's weakening grip on her own body meant a loosening grip on her kingdom. In the corridors outside her chambers, the court transformed into a chessboard where every move anticipated her death. Nobles who had once sought her favor now positioned themselves around those who would hold power after she was gone. Ambassadors sent urgent dispatches to their monarchs, assessing how long the queen might last and what her death would mean for European politics. Ferdinand faced an impossible tangle of emotions. He had ruled alongside Isabella for 30 years. Their marriage had been a partnership that reshaped Spain, a political alliance that became something more complex: respect, shared ambition, genuine affection mixed with calculation. But Castile was hers by blood, not his. He held Aragon independently, but his authority in Castile existed only through her. When she died, he would lose half his power unless he could secure his position. He loved her. He also needed her alive, or needed to control what came after. Those two realities existed simultaneously, twisting his grief into something more complicated than simple mourning. The question everyone whispered was singular: who will rule Castile? Isabella's heir was their daughter Joanna, married to Philip of Burgundy. But Joanna's mental stability had become a concern. She suffered from severe depression and episodes of erratic behavior that made many nobles doubt her fitness to govern. Some factions supported her claim regardless. Others quietly backed Ferdinand taking regency. Still others saw opportunity for their own advancement in the chaos of disputed succession. Isabella understood all of it. Even through fever and pain, her political instincts remained intact. She fought to maintain control over the one thing that still mattered, ensuring the succession went according to her will. In moments of lucidity, when the pain ebbed enough for her to focus, she revised her testament. She received advisors and issued commands with the same authority she had always wielded, though now her voice was weak and her hands shook. She insisted repeatedly that Joanna was the legitimate heir to Castile, that the kingdom must not be absorbed into Aragon or Burgundy, that the unity she had built must survive her. The cruelty was absolute. She had spent 3 decades consolidating power, unifying crowns, imposing her authority over fractious nobles. She had survived civil war, political plots, and constant challenges to her legitimacy. Now she lay in bed, aware enough to watch her court prepare for her absence, to see the alliances forming around a future that did not include her. Power abhors a vacuum. The moment her ability to enforce her will faltered, that vacuum began to form, and there was nothing she could do except speak, sign documents, and hope her commands would outlast her breath. In early 1504, something inside Isabella gave way. The exact moment is lost to history, but the consequences were recorded in horrified detail by those who witnessed what followed. She experienced a sudden, severe escalation of pain, a rupture that her attendants described as causing her to cry out in a way she never had before. One chronicler noted that guards outside her chamber heard the scream and rushed inside, believing she was being attacked. She claimed it was merely a cramp, but from that night forward, everything changed. What likely happened was the rupture of a pelvic abscess that had been growing for months, possibly years. When such an abscess bursts, it releases infected fluid directly into the abdominal cavity. The peritoneum, the membrane lining the abdomen, becomes inflamed in response. This condition, peritonitis, triggers a cascade of catastrophic consequences. The infection spreads rapidly across the abdominal organs. The body's immune response creates widespread inflammation. Fluid accumulates in the abdomen, causing severe swelling. Toxins from the bacteria enter the bloodstream, leading to sepsis. Isabella's abdomen became rigid and distended, hard as wood beneath the skin. Her fever, already persistent, spiked 2 levels that left her delirious. Her breathing grew rapid and shallow, each breath a struggle as the infection and swelling pressed against her diaphragm. Her pulse raced erratically, sometimes fluttering so fast her attendants could barely count it. Other times, slowing to a thread they feared would stop entirely. Her kidneys began to fail. The volume of her urine decreased dramatically, then nearly stopped. What little she produced was dark brown, concentrated with the waste. Her failing kidneys could no longer filter. Toxins built up in her bloodstream, contributing to the confusion and delirium that increasingly claimed her. She drifted between consciousness and delirium. In lucid moments, she recognized where she was and who surrounded her. But these moments grew shorter and less frequent. More often, she existed in a fevered twilight. She spoke to people who were not present. She called for her son Juan, dead since 1497. She asked for her daughter Isabella, who had died in childbirth in 1498. She sometimes believed she was back at the siege of Granada, muttering about troop positions and supply lines. Her confessor sat beside her constantly, but even he could not always anchor her to the present. The smell intensified beyond anything her attendants had experienced. It was not merely the odor of fever and unwashed illness. This was the smell of necrosis, of tissue dying inside a living body. The infection had caused localized areas of her abdominal tissue to rot. Incense burned in thick clouds, but it could not mask what everyone in the chamber understood. The queen was decomposing while still breathing. Her physicians continued their treatments, more bloodletting, more purgatives, more prayers, but their movements had changed. They no longer worked with the confidence of men who believed they could heal. They worked with the mechanical precision of men going through motions they knew were futile. They could see her abdomen, swollen and hard. They could feel the heat of her fever. They could smell the decay. Medical theory gave them no framework for understanding what was happening, but human experience told them what it meant. Her chamber became a death watch. Her ladies-in-waiting stayed with her constantly, bathing her face with cool cloths, changing her linens, holding her hand when she cried out. They wept openly. Servants who had served her for decades stood in corners, praying silently. Ferdinand visited frequently, his face drawn. The court beyond the door had gone quiet, a palace holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the queen, who had defined an age, would finally stop fighting. She was not dead yet, but death had moved into the room with her, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time. On November 26, 1504, Isabella of Castile entered her final day. She had been bedridden for weeks, drifting in and out of consciousness, but on this morning her attendants noticed a change. Her breathing had become more labored, slower, with longer pauses between each breath. Her pulse was faint and irregular. Her skin had taken on a greyish pallor. Those who had attended dying monarchs before recognized the signs. Her confessor, Fray Francisco Jiménez, the Cisneros Administrador de las Rites. Isabella was lucid enough to participate, though her voice was barely a whisper. She made her final confession, received communion, and asked for the prayers for the dying to be recited. Her faith, which had defined so much of her reign, remained with her to the end. She clutched the crucifix she had kept at her bedside throughout her illness, her fingers trembling but firm around it. Ferdinand was present, sitting close to her bed. Whatever political calculations had occupied his mind in recent weeks had fallen away. He held her hand. They spoke briefly, though what passed between them in those final moments was never recorded. She reaffirmed, one last time, that Joanna must inherit Castile. He nodded, whether in agreement or simple acknowledgement. History does not say. Her ladies-in-waiting surrounded the bedwomen who had served her for years, who had dressed her, counseled her, witnessed her strength, and now her dissolution. They wept quietly, maintaining the dignity their queen would have expected even now. Other attendants stood along the walls, silent witnesses to the end of an era. In the early afternoon, Isabella had a final moment of clarity. Her eyes focused. She seemed to see the people around her with recognition. She tried to speak, managed a few words about the succession and her children. Then her voice faded. Her breathing grew shallower. The pauses between breaths lengthened. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Isabella exhaled. Her chest rose slightly, fell, and did not rise again. Her hand relaxed around the crucifix. The tension that had held her face tight with pain for months eased. For several seconds, no one in the chamber moved. They watched, waiting to see if she would breathe again. She did not. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, quietly, someone began to pray. Others joined. Ferdinand bowed his head. One of her ladies reached forward and gently closed the queen's eyes. The formal announcement came within the hour. Messengers were dispatched throughout the palace, then to the cities of Castile and beyond. Isabella I of Castile, Queen of Castile and Leon, had died. She was 53 years old. She had ruled for 30 years. The court's reaction was complex. There was genuine grief. Many had served her faithfully and admired her, despite her severity. But there was also immediate, practical movement. Power had shifted the instant her heart stopped. Factions that had been positioning themselves carefully now moved openly. Ferdinand's authority in Castile became immediately uncertain. Joanna was queen, but she was in Flanders, mentally unstable, and married to a foreign prince. Spain entered a period of profound uncertainty, all because one woman's body had finally surrendered to infection.